The town sold Clara Hargrove the ruined fire station for $10 and called it an honor. Her son Marcus called it a liability before the ink was dry. Councilman Ron Briggs called it a gesture, a respectful way to recognize her grandfather, Earl Jerome Hargrove, the first fire chief of Station 3. But Clara had spent 31 years as a postal clerk, and 31 years reading addresses had taught her one thing: when a document looks too simple, read what people left out. So the next morning she unlocked the old station herself. The scrape of steel on concrete broke the silence before anything else did. Clara had pulled the last locker 6 inches from the back wall, just enough before she stopped to catch her breath. The locker was original 1938 steel, the kind built to last by men who didn't trust things that weren't built to last. It had not moved in 87 years. The concrete floor beneath it had left a pale rectangle where no dust had ever settled, and the wall behind it was a different color from the rest, darker, untouched by the years of light and air that had aged everything else in the station. She had almost missed it. Set into the wall at waist height, precisely centered behind the locker, was a rectangular recess sealed with a fitted concrete panel, so flush with the surrounding wall that it read as solid unless the light caught the seam. At the center of the panel was a tiny brass pull ring. Flat, tarnished, waiting. Clara reached into her coat pocket and found the brass key she had taken from the station hook beside the door that morning, small, worn, ordinary enough to overlook. Her son's voice came back to her from the voicemail she had listened to twice on the drive over. "Mom, it's a liability. You paid $10 for a demolition project. Please, let the town take it back." Clara closed both hands around the brass ring and pulled. The panel swung inward on a hinge so well fitted it moved without resistance, as if it had been opened last week instead of hidden for most of a century. Inside the recess sat a green Army surplus metal box. Clara lifted it out with both hands and set it on top of the locker. The latch opened cleanly. Inside was a folded county deed, a small fire chief's journal, and a sealed envelope addressed in her grandfather's handwriting. She put on her reading glasses and opened the deed first. Near the bottom, beneath the typed legal language, 7 handwritten lines had survived 87 years in pencil. She read them once, then again. When the land ceases, active fire service ownership reverts to the Hargrove heirs. Clara looked back at the old station wall, at the open recess, at the brass ring still moving slightly in the quiet. Her grandfather had told her once when she was 5 years old that the land under the station was only loaned. She had thought he meant it poetically. He had not meant it poetically at all. She did not rush getting out of the car. Dot Hargrove sat behind the wheel of her Buick for a long moment, engine off, hands in her lap, looking at Station 3 through the windshield. The building was brick-solid Depression-era, brick the kind laid by men who understood that a fire station needed to outlast the men inside it. The 2 arched apparatus bay doors were rusted in their tracks, the kind of rust that comes from 5 years of disuse, after decades of hard use. Weeds had pushed up through the cracks in the concrete apron in front, not the aggressive weeds of full abandonment, but the patient kind working slowly through whatever opening presented itself. Above the doors bolted directly into the brick in letters cast from Iron Station 3, 1938. She had driven past this building her entire life. She had never once stopped to look at it the way she was looking at it now. Her grandfather's name was on the founding photograph in Mill Haven Town Hall. She had seen it at the centennial celebration 3 years ago, noticed it briefly, moved on. Earl Jerome Hargrove, 1st Chief Station 3. The photograph showed a younger man than she remembered standing in front of this same facade, one hand resting on the apparatus door, as if confirming it was solid. He had that look. He confirmed things by touching them. She had not known him well. He died in 1974 when Dot was 24, and he had not been the kind of man who gathered grandchildren around him. He came to Sunday dinners occasionally, sat at the end of the table, said little, and left early. He was not cold. She had never felt unwelcome in his presence. He was simply occupied in the way of men who carry large responsibilities quietly and have learned to hold most of it inside. Absolutely reliable by every account that had ever reached her. Not warm in the conventional way, reliable. She got out of the car. Councilman Briggs had shaken her hand at the signing with the particular warmth of a man presenting a gift he had no intention of examining closely. A gesture, he had said. A recognition of your grandfather's service to this community. Station 3 was Earl's life's work. It felt right that it should go back to the family. He had not said the new central station rendered this building obsolete in 2019. He had not said we have had a commercial developer inquiring about this parcel for the past 18 months. He had not said we expect the building to come down within the year and the land to return to productive use. He had said gesture with the easy fluency of a man for whom that word had always been sufficient. Dot had heard all of it. She had signed anyway. 31 years as a postal clerk had given her a particular and unromantic relationship with documents. She trusted them more than she trusted explanations. Whatever this building was, and whatever the councilman had meant by gesture, it was now hers on paper, and paper in her experience was the only version of anything that held. She unlocked the side entrance with the key the town had provided and went inside. She walked Station 3 the way she had always walked an unfamiliar postal route methodically, without rushing establishing the geography, before looking for anything specific. The apparatus bay, first bare concrete floor, oil-stained in the dark irregular patterns of decades of engine work, cold in the March air that came through the gaps around the bay doors. 2 bays each wide enough for a full-size pumper. Empty for 5 years since the decommissioning, the absence of equipment making the space feel larger than it was. Overhead, the original steel beam structure solid, the walls brick throughout no visible water damage at the base. Along the back wall, a row of 8 gear lockers. Original 1938 steel. She could tell by the weight of them the particular thickness of the doors. The ventilation slots cut along the top, in a pattern she had seen in photographs of Depression-era municipal buildings. Heavy pull handles, the chrome worn to bare metal on most of them. At eye level on each locker, a small rectangular nameplate holder, the kind designed to take a stamped metal insert. Most of the holders were empty. The nameplates had been removed at decommissioning, she assumed, or sometime in the years before. Standard procedure when a station closes. You take the names with you, most of them. On the 4th locker from the left, the nameplate was still in its holder. Brushed metal, the edges slightly oxidized, the lettering stamped in capitals that had kept their definition across 87 years. Chiefy Hargrove. Dot stopped walking. She stood in front of it for a long moment. She had not expected that to feel like anything. It felt like something. Not grief, exactly. She had grieved her grandfather a long time ago, in the mild and distant way you grieve people you knew as a child and understood only partially. Something quieter than grief. The particular feeling of encountering a name in an unexpected place and being reminded suddenly that the person it belonged to had been real in ways you never fully accounted for. She pulled the locker open. Inside, empty. The interior walls still held their original paint, a specific institutional green, the color of Depression-era public buildings applied once in 1938 and never touched since. No one had repainted these. No one had reason to. A single brass hook was screwed into the back panel, centered at a height that suggested deliberate placement rather than convenience. The kind of hook you install for one specific thing. On the hook, a key, small flat old brass. Not a padlock key, the barrel was too narrow, too precise. More like a filing cabinet key, or a lockbox key, the kind made for a specific mechanism rather than a standard fitting. No label, no tag. Just the key on the hook, hanging at the center of the back panel of her grandfather's locker, exactly where it would be if someone had placed it there with the intention that it stay. Dot lifted it off the hook and held it in her palm. She turned it over once. The bow was slightly flattened on the left side from years of handling, but the handling was old. No one had touched this recently. The barrel was darkened with age, the metal carrying that particular density she associated with hardware made before the war, before manufacturing learned to do things faster and lighter. She had no idea what it opened. She closed her hand around it and put it in her coat pocket and kept walking. The chief's quarters were at the back of the station, one room, one window looking out at the alley, a cast-iron radiator that had not run since 2019, a wooden chair beside the window, a hook on the wall where a coat had hung for 36 years and then never hung again. She sat in the chair and took the key from her pocket and held it up in the gray March light coming through the dusty glass. Flat bow, single barrel. Made before 1950, she estimated the weight of it the finish. She had spent 31 years sorting and routing and delivering matching keys to lockboxes in 100 postal facilities, learning in that work the simple, reliable fact that a key kept in a specific place on a specific hook was a key meant to be found, not forgotten, not lost, kept. Somebody had put it there on purpose. Somebody always did. She set the key on the chair beside her and took out her notepad. Before we go further, if something in Dot's story is staying with you already, the sense of a building that has been waiting for someone to finally look at it carefully, this channel was made for you. Every week we find another room that was sealed too long. Subscribe so you're here when the next one opens. She was back before the light was fully up. Dot had not slept particularly well, not from anxiety, but from the particular restlessness that comes when a methodical mind has been given an incomplete problem. The key was on her nightstand. She had looked at it twice in the night, not touching it, just confirming it was there. By 5:30 she had given up on sleep entirely, made coffee, filled her thermos, and driven to Station 3 in the gray, pre-dawn quiet of a March morning that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. She went straight through the front office to the apparatus bay without turning on the overhead fluorescence. The flashlight was sufficient. She preferred it, in fact. The focused beams suited the kind of work she had in mind. She had decided on the drive over to work through the locker row, systematically. Not because she expected anything specific. She did not yet have enough information to expect anything specific. But systematic was the only way she knew to work, and it was the approach that had served her for 3 decades of postal routes, sorting rooms, and the particular daily discipline of a job where the wrong address meant something went to the wrong place and stayed there. You started at the beginning. You worked to the end. You did not skip steps. She opened the first locker left to right the way she read, photographed the interior with her phone, noted the contents in her notepad, empty original paint intact single coat hook at the top. She closed it and moved to the second. Empty coat hook, a strip of tape along the top shelf, where someone had labeled something long ago, the label itself gone. She photographed it and noted it and moved on. The third held turnout gear, a coat and boots, the reflective tape yellowed and gone brittle with age, the fabric carrying a faint ghost of smoke that had survived decades of disuse. She photographed it without disturbing it and moved on. The sixth held more gear, the same condition. She left both as she found them. Between each locker, she checked the mounting hardware. The lockers were bolted to the back wall. She could see the bracket fittings at the rear interior of each unit, but the brackets were corroded, several separated entirely from the concrete. The lockers were effectively freestanding. She tested the first one. It moved forward several inches before catching on an uneven section of the concrete floor, a heave in the surface where decades of temperature change had worked through the slab. She worked her way along the row, pulling each unit away from the wall far enough to slide the flashlight beam into the gap behind it. Behind the first 7 concrete wall, uniformly gray, undisturbed. A few screw holes where old utility brackets had been mounted and removed at some point in the station's history. Nothing that invited attention. She was midway through the row, standing at the 5th locker with her notepad open when she called Chester Oakes. His name had come from her phone the previous evening, a newspaper archive photograph she had found while searching the station's history, the 50th anniversary celebration in 1988, a row of men in front of the apparatus bay doors. Chester Oakes had been in the front row, listed in the caption as retired 1985. She had found his number in the county white pages on the second try. He picked up on the third ring with the clear, unhurried baritone of a man who had spent 30 years on a fire crew and never lost the habit of answering directly. She introduced herself, said her grandfather's name. Chester was quiet for exactly 1 second. Then, I wondered if someone from Earl's family would ever come by the station. She asked him about the lockers, specifically whether they had been original to the building's construction or installed separately, whether Earl had done the work himself or contracted it. Chester paused before answering. Not the pause of a man searching for information, the pause of a man retrieving something he had filed away a very long time ago. He installed them himself, Chester said. The whole row. This would have been the winter of 38, maybe running into 39. He wouldn't let anyone help, said the back wall needed reinforcing and installing the lockers was the right way to do it properly. He worked on it 3 Sundays after services alone. The other men offered. He always said he had it. Dot wrote this in her notepad. He had installed the locker row himself in the winter of 1938, and he had not let anyone help. Chester had said it without emphasis, the way people described things they witnessed without fully understanding a detail noted at the time, filed without category, waiting 50 years for someone to ask the right question. She asked whether her grandfather had maintained any private storage in the building, somewhere separate from the shared storerooms. Chester paused again, longer this time. Earl kept everything important at the station, he said slowly. He always said it was the safest building in Millhaven, concrete and brick built to survive what other buildings couldn't. I took that as just Earl being Earl. Another pause. But I'll tell you something. In those early years before my time, from what the older men said, Earl spent a fair amount of time alone at the back wall, working on something they figured. Nobody asked. You didn't ask Earl Hargrove what he was doing if he didn't offer it. He stopped. I never thought much of it until right now. Dot thanked him and hung up. She stood in the middle of the apparatus bay for a moment, the flashlight in one hand and her notepad in the other, looking at the locker row. He had spent 3 Sundays at the back wall, working alone, wouldn't let anyone help. She went to the last locker, the 4th from the left, the one with the nameplate still in its holder. Chief E. Hargrove. She positioned herself on the left side, gripped the front edge of the unit with both gloved hands, planted her feet, and pulled steadily. The locker moved. 6 inches, 7. At 8 inches, it caught a warp in the concrete floor, a ridge in the slab where the surface had shifted at some point in 8 decades. She could not pull it further without a crowbar or a second person, neither of which she had brought. 8 inches was enough. She crouched down and angled the flashlight beam into the gap between the locker's back edge and the wall. The concrete here was different. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have drawn any attention if you had somehow managed to see it from across the room. But in the focused beam of the flashlight, the difference was clear, lighter in color than the surrounding wall by several shades, smoother in texture, finished with a care that the surrounding concrete had not received. A rectangular section approximately 18 inches wide and 12 inches tall, set at waist height, its edges straight and deliberate. Sealed with a fitted panel flush to within a fraction of an inch with the surrounding surface. At the panel's center, threaded into a small brass fitting set directly into the concrete, a pull ring. Flat, tarnished, the same color as the key in her coat pocket. The same era she knew it before she touched it, the way you know things after 31 years of handling hardware from a dozen different decades. She straightened up slowly. She looked at the back of the locker, then at the wall. Then she reached into her coat pocket and brought out the key and held it beside the ring without inserting it. Just held it there in the flashlight beam, the 2 pieces of brass side by side. The same metal, the same age, the same particular dullness of hardware that had been waiting in the same building for 87 years. Made for each other. Earl Hargrove had installed this locker row himself in the winter of 1938, had refused all help, had spent 3 Sundays alone at the back wall, had kept a key on a hook in his own locker for 36 years, and for the 9 years between his death and the station's closure, and for the 5 years since the decommissioning, the key had hung on its hook and waited while one chief succeeded another, and the building aged around it, and nobody moved the last locker, because nobody had a reason to. She had been carrying the answer in her coat pocket for 24 hours. She had been 30 seconds from it for 87 years. She called Marcus that evening from the station parking lot. She told him about the recess in the wall, the pull ring, the key. She told him methodically in the order she had discovered things without editorializing. She had always found that the plainest version of a story was the most convincing. Marcus's response came before she had finished. "Mom, don't touch anything until I get there. That building is structurally compromised. You don't know what's behind that panel. It could be a utility access. It could be asbestos containment. You don't know." She said she would call him after she opened it. He said, "That's not what I suggested." She said, "I know." She hung up and drove home and slept better than she had the night before. The next morning she returned alone. The apparatus bay was the same gray cold it had been every morning, the March light coming through the gaps in the bay doors, in thin, flat strips, the smell of old concrete and extinguished decades of machine oil. She had brought her work gloves and her flashlight and her reading glasses and her thermos, and she had also brought in her coat pocket a small pry bar she had found in her garage in case the locker needed more encouragement than she could provide with her hands alone. It did not. The pry bar set against the concrete floor ridge gave her the additional 4 inches she needed, and the locker came away from the wall, cleanly leaving the recess fully accessible for the first time in 87 years. She positioned herself directly in front of it, flashlight on, and looked at the pull ring. She had not examined it closely enough the previous morning. Now, in the direct beam of the flashlight, she could see what she had missed set behind the ring itself, recessed into the brass fitting, so that it was invisible from any angle except straight on a small lock housing, cylindrical the diameter of a pencil, the kind of lock mechanism built to last and built not to be noticed. She took the key from her coat pocket. She inserted it into the housing. The fit was immediate and clean, no forcing, no protest from decades of disuse, no grinding of oxidized tumblers. The key turned as if it had been used last week. One full rotation, smooth and certain, and the panel released. It did not pull outward. It swung inward on a concealed hinge set flush into the wall's left edge, a small door essentially built to look like solid concrete from every angle except the one angle that mattered. Earl had engineered it the way he had engineered everything she was beginning to understand, with complete attention to what it needed to do, and no attention whatsoever to what it looked like doing it. Behind the panel, a space 18 inches wide, 12 inches tall, 14 inches deep. Concrete on all 4 sides, and the back finish smooth, the same careful finishing she had noticed from outside the work of a man who wanted the interior to be dry and stable, and exactly as he left it. It had been sealed for 87 years, and the air that came out when the panel swung open was simply still. Not stale, not damp. Still. Preserved. Inside the space centered on the concrete shelf a green metal box. Army surplus, the kind issued during the Second World War, 12 inches long, 8 wide, 4 deep. The olive paint worn to bare metal at the corners from handling it had received before it was placed here. A flat latch on the front, no additional lock. The panel lock had been the lock. She lifted it out carefully, 2 hands, and was surprised by its lightness, not empty, but not heavy either. The lightness of paper, of documents. She carried it through the apparatus bay and into the station office and set it on the old wooden work table under the window where the morning light was best. She opened the latch. 3 items inside, arranged with the same deliberate organization as the notebooks in Ray Calloway's room, the same logic of a careful person who understood that the order in which things were found mattered. A manila folder, thick, sitting on top. A small leather journal beneath it, brown, the initials E.H., tooled simply into the cover. And beneath the journal a sealed white envelope with no name on the front, only a single line in her grandfather's handwriting in pencil, centered on the envelope's face. For whoever needs it. She set the journal and the envelope aside and opened the manila folder the way she had opened every unfamiliar file in 31 years of postal work from the top in order, without skipping ahead. The top document was a deed transfer. 1-page standard printed county form, the lines filled in her grandfather's compressed and careful hand. Earl Jerome Hargrove, to the town of Millhaven. Dated March 8, 1938. She read it straight through, the property description, the consideration amount, the standard transfer language. Routine. She turned the page. The second page was not standard form. It was handwritten 3 paragraphs lettered with the particular care of a man who had ruled the lines in pencil first to keep them straight, the ruling lines still faintly visible beneath the ink. At the bottom, Earl's initials, and beside them, the initials of a second party, TCA, and a notary seal dated March 8, 1938, the same day as the deed. She read the first paragraph once. Then she read it again more slowly, the way she read addresses that didn't quite resolve on the first pass. The language was the formal language of 1938 legal documents, slightly archaic, in phrasing precise in meaning. She translated it as she read the way she had always translated unfamiliar forms: strip out the ceremony, find the operative instruction. The land is transferred for the express and sole purpose of public fire service. She read on. If at any time the land ceases to be used for active public fire service operations. She read the next clause word by word. Ownership reverts automatically to Earl Jerome Hargrove, his heirs, and his assigns. She stopped. She read the word again. Automatically. Not pending review, not subject to petition or application or legal proceeding, not requiring notice to either party. The document was specific about this, her grandfather had been specific about this, or whoever had helped him draft this language had been specific, and the notary had witnessed and sealed it, and it had been filed, and it had waited. No additional consideration required, no court involvement, no negotiation. The reversion was automatic and immediate upon cessation of active fire service operations. Both parties acknowledged this clause and its terms at the time of signing. Dot set the page flat on the work table and looked at it for a moment. Then she turned it over. On the back of the page, not part of the notarized document, not witnessed, not dated in pencil, in the same compressed hand she now recognized as her grandfather's writing at its most direct. Station 3 will close someday. When it does, the ground goes home. She read it once. She read it again. She set the page back on the table and took out her notepad and wrote 4 things in a column. Station 3 decommissioned September 2019. New Central Station opened March 2019. Reversion clause filed March 1938. Today's date. She did the arithmetic without a calculator, the way she had always done delivery counts, her thumb, moving through the numbers in her coat pocket, while her eyes stayed on the page. 4.5 years. The reversion had already happened. It had happened automatically on the day Station 3's doors closed for active fire service operations in September 2019, exactly as Earl had written it would, with no notice required. No legal proceeding, no negotiation. The ground had gone home 4.5 years ago, on a day when Dot was living 40 minutes away, and did not know this building existed as anything other than a landmark she drove past without stopping. The town had been managing property that belonged to her for 4.5 years without knowing it. The developer had been negotiating for land the town had no legal right to sell. Councilman Briggs had shaken her hand and called it a gesture, a $10 gesture for a building sitting on land that had not been the town's to gesture with since the month the new Central Station opened. None of them had moved the last locker. None of them had looked. Earl Hargrove had written this clause into a notarized legal document in March 1938 and sealed it behind a steel locker in a concrete wall and trusted that it would hold through whatever came after him through 36 years of his own tenure, through the chiefs who followed him through the politics of town councils and development proposals, and 5 years of vacancy, and it had held. Not because anyone had protected it, because he had built it correctly the first time and trusted the building to keep it, until someone from his family came through the door and moved the last locker. September 2019. He had not known the date. He had known the condition. He had written it once in pencil on the back of a notarized document in 1938, and it had been enough. She set the deed aside and opened the journal. The cover was brown leather, soft with age, the initials E.H. tooled simply into the lower right corner. Not decorative, just identified the way Earl Hargrove identified everything that belonged to him. She opened it to the first page and began to read from the beginning without skipping the way she approached everything unfamiliar. The handwriting was the same compressed, precise script she had seen on the deed, the handwriting of a man who had learned to write when paper was not wasted, and economy of movement was a virtue rather than a style. The ink in the early pages had gone brown with age, but remained legible throughout. Earl had pressed firmly. He had always pressed firmly, she suspected. It was that kind of handwriting. The early entries documented the station's construction and first operational year. The crew names she did not recognize, men long dead. The first calls a house fire on Clement Street in October 1938, a barn fire the following spring. Equipment records, budget notes. Earl wrote the way a man records what matters without editorializing, without sentiment, in the plain, declarative language of someone who trusts the facts to carry their own weight. She read for 20 minutes, turning pages carefully, letting the station's early life come through in fragments. She was midway through the 1950s entries when she found the first one that changed the quality of the journal. February 14th, 1962. She read it once quickly. Then she went back to the beginning of the entry and read it again at the pace it deserved. A man named Elwood Pruitt had approached the town council with a commercial development proposal for the Station 3 parcel. He had wanted the fire service relocated to the east side of Millhaven to free the land for a commercial building project. Earl had learned of the proposal through the council agenda. His name had not been on the notice, which she suspected had been intentional on someone's part. He had appeared before the council on Tuesday evening. He had brought the deed. He had read the reversionary clause aloud in full at the council table. Pruitt had called it a technicality. She could hear the dismissiveness in the word even filtered through Earl's flat reporting of it decades later. Earl had responded in the same tone. He wrote everything without heat, without drama, with the particular steadiness of a man who has already done the preparation and does not need to perform confidence because he actually has it. The document is 24 years old and properly filed at the county recorder's office. Document number 1938-D-0047. If the council disagrees with my reading, they may hire a title attorney at their convenience. The proposal had been tabled. The entry ended there. Dot took her pencil and underlined the document number. Then she wrote it in her notepad and put a box around it. She turned to the next entry, referencing the station's land 1968, another developer, another council meeting, another appearance by Earl with the same document. The same result. The proposal had been withdrawn within 2 weeks. Earl had written 4 sentences about it, none of them triumphant. He had gone back to work the next morning. She could tell from the next entry that he had gone back to work the next morning as if nothing had happened, because for him, nothing particular had happened. He had done what the document required him to do, and the document had done what it was built to do. He had been practicing. Dot understood now, sitting in the station office with the morning light coming through the dusty window. He had been practicing for the 3rd time. For the appearance he would not be alive to make at a council table, he would not be present at for a clause he had spent 33 years maintaining and defending and trusting to outlast him. The entries from 1969 onward shifted in tone. They were quieter, shorter. Earl wrote about the station aging, the apparatus needing replacement, the roof needing attention, the younger crew he was training with the particular patience of a man building something to outlast himself. He wrote one entry about Dot's father's passing in 1969, 3 sentences, plain no elaboration. He wrote very little about himself throughout. The final entry was dated October 14th, 1971, 3 years before Earl died. Dot read it slowly, the way she had learned to read the final pages of important documents, not rushing toward the end, but staying with each sentence until it was finished. He wrote that he had put everything in the box behind the locker. Deed, journal, letter. The key was where it had always been. He had told no one. If the station closed in his lifetime, he wrote he would retrieve the box himself and act on the clause directly. If it closed after he was gone, and here his handwriting slowed slightly, the letters no larger but the spacing between them slightly wider, the pace of a man choosing his words with particular care, someone would come. They would find the key because they would look carefully. A Hargrove who looked carefully would find what was there to be found. Then the sentence she would carry with her for a long time after. People only clean things when something has changed. That has always been enough time. It will be enough time. Dot sat with that for a moment. He had understood with the patience of a man who had waited out 2 development proposals across 3 decades that the locker row would not be moved until someone had a reason to move it. He had built his plan around the reliable human tendency to leave alone what does not appear to need attention. He had been correct for 87 years, through every town council administration, through the chiefs who followed him through the decommissioning and the 5 years of vacancy, and Councilman Briggs's easy handshake and the developers' quiet negotiations. Nobody had moved the last locker. Nobody had had a reason to. She closed the journal carefully and set it beside the deed. She picked up the sealed white envelope. For whoever needs it. She opened it with the same care she had brought to everything in the green metal box, not reverence exactly, but the respect owed to something that had been waiting a long time. Inside a single sheet of Station 3 letterhead, Mill Haven Fire Department. Station 3, the same header as the deed, the ink slightly faded but fully legible, dated May 3rd, 1971, 5 months before the final journal entry. Earl had written the letter first, she understood, and then written the journal entry to confirm that the letter was in the box. He had sequenced it. 2 names at the top of the letter, the county deed recorder's office full address, and a law firm in the county seat she did not recognize. She wrote both names in her notepad. Below the names in Earl's compressed hand, the instructions, "The deed is valid." The reversionary clause was filed with the county recorder March 8, 1938, document number 1938-D-0047. It has never been amended, dissolved, or superseded. The town will say it was a formality. It was not a formality. It was the terms. Present document 1938-D-0047 to the recorder's office. Ask for the original filing. That will be enough. She read it once. She read the document number again, confirmed it matched the number in her notepad. Then she read the next section, separated from the instructions by a full line space, as if Earl had wanted to be sure whoever was reading understood that what followed was different in kind from what came before. "I don't know who you are, but if you found the key and came this far, you're a Hargrove. Act like one." Dot set the letter flat on the work table. She looked at all 4 items arranged in front of her, the green metal box closed, now its purpose fulfilled. The deed, the reversionary clause visible on the second page. The journal, 53 years of a fire chief's working life, compressed into a brown leather cover. And the letter, 1 page, 2 paragraphs, a document number, and a closing instruction written in 1971 to a person Earl Hargrove did not know for a situation he could not predict, with a precision that had survived everything that had happened in the 87 years since he sealed the door. He had not been angry when he wrote it. She was certain of that. He had not been afraid. He had been organized the way he was organized about everything that mattered, the way he had appeared before the council in 1962 and 1968 without drama, and returned to work the next morning without fanfare, because the work was the point, and the document was the instrument, and the rest was noise. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the second ring. She did not build to it. She read him the last 2 sentences of the letter word by word at the pace they deserved. Marcus was quiet for a long time. Grandad Earl wrote that. In 1971, Dot said, before he died. Another silence. She could hear him recalibrating on the other end of the line, the particular silence of someone revising a position they had held with confidence. What does document 1938-D-0047 say? Dot looked at the number in her notepad. She had written it 3 times now, the way she used to write difficult postal codes until they were part of her. "I'm going to the county recorder's office tomorrow morning at 8:30, she said, "to find out officially. I want to stop here and ask you something. Did you ever discover that someone in your life had been protecting you quietly for years, maybe decades, and you didn't know until you needed it? A parent, a grandparent, someone who said very little and planned very much? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one." The county recorder's office opened at 8:30. Dot was there at 8:33 with Earl's instruction letter in a manila folder, her phone with the deed photographs, her notepad, and her reading glasses on their chain. She had not brought Marcus, who had flown in from Phoenix the previous evening and was waiting at her kitchen table with coffee and the particular expression of a man who had spent the flight revising his understanding of a situation. She had told him she would call him when she had something official to report. He had said he wanted to come. She had said she knew. She walked to the counter and said, "I need to see document 1938-D-0047. The woman behind the counter, Ann Fielding, according to the nameplate county deed records officer, entered the number into her system with the efficient neutrality of someone who had processed thousands of requests and had learned long ago not to form opinions about them in advance. She disappeared into the archive and returned in 4 minutes with a document folder which she placed on the viewing table to the right of the counter without comment. She set it down. She stepped back. She waited. Dot sat at the viewing table and opened the folder. 2 pages. Standard county deed form on top exactly as she had photographed it from Earl's copy. The same printed lines, the same format, the same fields filled in her grandfather's compressed hand. She laid her phone beside the document and compared them line by line. Property description identical. Consideration amount identical. Transfer parties identical. She worked through every line on the first page before turning to the second. The handwritten clause. 3 paragraphs, the ruled pencil lines still faintly visible beneath the ink, the same careful lettering she had been reading for 3 days. She compared each sentence to her photograph. Each one matched exactly. The notary seal at the bottom of the county copy was clearer than Earl's version. She could read the notary's full name, and commission number could see that the seal had been impressed firmly into the page and had held its definition across 87 years. Then she saw the margin. On the right side of the second page, beside the first paragraph of the reversionary clause, someone had added a notation in pencil, a different hand from Earl's, smaller, the writing of an office worker rather than a fire chief. Added years after the original filing by the slight difference in the pencil's color and the paper's surface where it had been written. 5 words. Chief Hargrove Development Inquiry resolved. 1962. Dot looked at it for a long moment without touching it. The county had recorded Earl's appearance. They had marked the resolution. Somewhere in the institutional memory of this building for 63 years, there had been a notation that the Station 3 deed carried a condition and that the condition had been invoked and upheld. Someone had sat at a desk in this office in 1962 after Earl appeared before the council and read the clause aloud, and Elwood Pruitt called it a technicality, and the proposal was tabled, and that someone had pulled the original document from the archive and added 5 words in pencil and filed it back. No one had connected those 5 words to anything in 63 years. No one had looked. Ann Fielding was still standing at a careful distance, professionally neutral, watching Dot read with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for people to finish understanding things. "Do you have an attorney?" she asked when Dot looked up. "I'm calling one this morning. I'll need to note that this document has been requested and reviewed," Ann said, with the requester identified as a potential heir of the original transfer. "Please do," Dot said. She asked the question Earl's letter had prepared her to ask. She asked it precisely in the words Earl had written. "Has this document been amended, superseded, or dissolved at any point since its filing date of March 8, 1938? Ann turned to her computer, typed, reviewed the file history, typed again. The office was very quiet. She looked up. "No," she said, "it has not." Dot wrote this in her notepad, dated and timed. Ann Fielding had given her the name of a title attorney in the county seat with a level of directness that conveyed more than the recommendation itself, the particular precision of a public official who cannot say what she thinks but can say exactly what she knows and leave the inference to the person she is speaking to. Sylvia Tran. Dot called from the parking lot and had an appointment by noon. Sylvia's office was orderly in the way that conveyed genuine organization rather than performance of it. The kind of desk that looked clear because the person behind it processed everything promptly, not because they had moved it aside for a meeting. She reviewed all documents that afternoon: the county copy, Dot's photographs, the instruction letter, the journal entries, the deed Earl had kept in the green metal box. She read without interrupting herself. When she finished, she set everything in a neat stack and looked at Dot across the desk and delivered her findings in the kind of sentences that did not invite debate. "The reversionary clause is valid," she said. "Properly filed, properly witnessed, properly notarized. Legally constituted as a deed restriction and condition of transfer under state property law applicable in 1938. She paused for exactly 1 second. "Not superseded by any subsequent revision." She looked at her legal pad. The trigger condition cessation of active fire service operations was met when Station 3 was formally decommissioned in September 2019. Under the explicit terms of this deed, ownership of the land reverted automatically to the Hargrove heirs at that time. She said the word once. Then she said it again, slightly more slowly, with the particular care of someone who wants a client to understand not just the meaning, but the weight of a word. Automatic. Not conditional on petition, not requiring legal proceeding or court filing or formal notice to either party, not subject to negotiation or the goodwill of the town council or the opinion of a commercial developer. As of September 2019, while Councilman Briggs was attending budget meetings and approving planning documents and preparing his warm handshake and his word gesture, the ground under Station 3 had already gone home. Earl had arranged this in 1938. He had arranged it specifically to be automatic. Sylvia continued. The town's transfer in March, the $10 transaction, the signed paperwork, Briggs's handshake, had been technically a transfer of the building structure. But since the building sat on land that had not been the town's to convey, since September 2019, the transaction carried legal complications requiring formal address. At minimum, the town needed official notification that the reversionary clause had been triggered and that a Hargrove heir had identified herself and was represented by counsel. Dot asked about the developer. Sylvia's expression did not change. She asked Dot to describe everything she had observed at the signing: Briggs's demeanor, his framing the pace of the transaction. Dot described it the way she described everything, plainly in order, without editorializing. Briggs's warmth, the word gesture used twice, his slight hurry to reach the signature line. Sylvia wrote something in her legal pad. "I'll make some calls this afternoon," she said. The calls surfaced what Dot had begun to estimate from the shape of the thing. In the 8 months before the $10 transfer, the town had been in preliminary negotiation with a regional commercial developer for a mixed-use project, ground floor retail residential above, requiring the Station 3 parcel as its anchor footprint. The transfer had been structured to give the town flexibility. If Dot proved cooperative, a buyback could be negotiated at a controlled price, framed as a fair offer to a family who had gratefully received a building they couldn't use. If she proved difficult, the transfer could be contested or unwound before anything reached a public record that would require explanation. What the town had not done in 2 years of project planning was commission a title search that traced the chain of ownership to the original 1938 deed. What the developer had not done in preliminary negotiations that had reached the stage of architectural renderings was require independent title verification before proceeding. They had relied on the town's assurance of clear ownership. The town's assurance had been incorrect. Sylvia called Dot that evening with the last piece of it. "In 30 years of title work," she said, "I have very rarely seen a commercial developer proceed to preliminary negotiations without a complete chain of title. It is a basic step." A pause. The absence of it in this case suggests they relied on the town's representation rather than independent verification. That representation was incorrect. The town did not have clear ownership of the land. They had not had it since September 2019. Dot was sitting at her kitchen table with her notepad and her reading glasses, and the green metal box in front of her closed its purpose fulfilled. "My grandfather filed that document in 1938, she said. "He knew the condition. He wrote it explicitly." "He did," Sylvia said, "and the county has had it on file unmodified for 87 years. A brief pause. Document 1938-D-0047 is not ambiguous, Mrs. Hargrove. It never was. The notice went out on a Monday morning. Sylvia had drafted it over the weekend. Dot knew this because she had received a call Saturday evening asking her to confirm 2 dates and a spelling, and Sylvia's voice had carried the focused quiet of someone working through something carefully on a day off. The letter arrived in Dot's email Sunday night. She read it at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on, and Earl's green metal box sitting closed beside her coffee mug, the way it had been sitting for the past several days, its purpose fulfilled, but its presence still necessary somehow. Formal notice of ownership claim, reversionary clause, document 1938-D-0047, trigger condition met September 2019. Ownership reverted automatically to the Hargrove heirs. She read it twice. She did not understand every phrase in the legal sections. She was a retired postal clerk, not an attorney, but she understood the shape of it completely. Her grandfather had built this protection in 1938. Sylvia had confirmed it in 2024. The town had managed land that wasn't theirs for 5 years without knowing it, and now the town had to read what Earl Hargrove had written. She signed it and sent it back. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday at 10 in the small conference room behind Millhaven Town Hall. Not the council chamber. That detail had not escaped her. Councilman Briggs had requested through his office a preliminary discussion before any public misunderstanding developed. Sylvia had smiled slightly when she read that phrase aloud over the phone. People usually say misunderstanding, she said, when they mean paperwork they wish had stayed buried. Marcus flew in from Phoenix Wednesday night. He had been calling every day since Dot read him Earl's last line over the phone, the calls gradually shifting in tone from concerned to careful to something that was trying to become useful. He arrived at her door with a rolling suitcase and the expression of a man who had spent a 5-hour flight recalculating a situation he had assessed too quickly. He offered to carry the green metal box for her Thursday morning. Dot said no. Some things needed to be carried by the person they had been left for. She wore her gray coat, reading glasses on their chain. She carried the box in both hands, not because it was heavy, but because carrying it that way felt correct, the way certain things feel correct without requiring explanation. Marcus walked beside her without speaking. She appreciated that. They arrived 5 minutes early. The conference room was smaller than she expected. A rectangular table, 6 chairs, a window overlooking the parking lot, the flat March light coming through the glass without opinion. Ron Briggs was already seated at the far end, his hands folded on the table in the practiced arrangement of a man who had conducted a great many preliminary discussions. Beside him, the town attorney, a younger man with a legal pad, and the careful, neutral expression of someone paid to be careful and neutral. Across from them, a planning officer Dot did not recognize. And at the corner of the table, in a navy suit that had not been chosen casually, a man she did not know until Sylvia leaned close. "Developer representative," Sylvia said quietly. "Nathan Vale." Vale stood when they entered too quickly, the reflexive courtesy of a man accustomed to controlling rooms who had just registered that this room might not be his to control. "Mrs. Hargrove," he extended his hand. "Nathan Vale. We've been in preliminary conversation with the town regarding the redevelopment potential of this parcel." Dot shook his hand. She set the green metal box on the table. The sound it made was not dramatic. It was simply the sound of a metal box meeting a wooden table, ordinary, brief, unremarkable. But every person in the room looked at it. Something about its age, its plainness, the olive paint worn to bare metal at the corners, it had the quality of an object that had been somewhere a long time and had arrived with information. Sylvia set her folder on the table and opened it without ceremony. She did not begin with the history. She did not begin with Earl or 1938 or the locker or any of the story that had led to this room. She began exactly where the document began. Document 1938-D-0047, she said, was filed at the Millhaven County Recorder's Office on March 8, 1938. It has never been amended, dissolved, or superseded in the 86 years since its filing. The town attorney shifted in his chair, a small movement barely perceptible, the kind that belongs to someone who has just heard the first sentence of an argument and recognized its structure. Ron Briggs kept his hands folded. Nathan Vale's expression did not change yet. It would. Sylvia continued without pausing. The deed transferred the Station 3 parcel to the town of Millhaven for the express and sole purpose of active public fire service operations. The deed contains a handwritten, notarized reversionary clause, witnessed initialed by both parties and properly recorded at the time of filing. The clause states that upon cessation of active public fire service operations, ownership of the land reverts automatically to Earl Jerome Hargrove, his heirs, and his assigns. No additional consideration required, no legal proceeding required, no notice required. She let the words sit for a moment. Automatic. Station 3 was formally decommissioned in September 2019. She slid a copy of the county record across the table, the original filing stamp, the notary seal, the marginal notation from 1962, all visible. The trigger condition was met at that time. The reversion occurred at that time. No one spoke. Dot looked at Ron Briggs. He had the same surface warmth she remembered from the signing, the practiced municipal warmth of a man who had spent his career managing public expectations. But it had thinned. Underneath it, visible now in the slight tension around his eyes, was the expression of someone doing arithmetic and not liking the results. He said, "Mrs. Hargrove, I want to be clear the town acted in complete good faith. The $10 transfer was a gesture of respect for your grandfather's service. That was always the intention." Dot said, "I remember." She said it quietly, without heat. She had not come here to be heated. In 31 years at the post office, Councilman, I learned one thing consistently. When someone calls something a gesture, they are usually describing a transaction they expect to cost them nothing. Ron looked down at his folded hands. The town attorney cleared his throat. There may be reasonable questions regarding the enforceability of a clause of this age, given subsequent municipal... Sylvia slid another document across the table before he finished the sentence. There are always interpretive questions, she said. This is not one of them. She tapped the page. The clause is legally constituted under state property law applicable at the time of filing. It has not been superseded. It has not been contested. It has not been amended. The county has held it on record unmodified since March 8, 1938. Nathan Vale reached for the document. Sylvia did not release it. She said the developer has no agreement with the lawful owner of this land. The sentence settled into the room slowly, the way precise sentences do, when the people hearing them understand that precision is not being used carelessly. Vale sat back. Dot opened Earl's journal. She had bookmarked the 1962 entry with a strip of paper the night before. She opened to it, turned the journal around, and set it in the center of the table without explaining the context. She let them look at the date, at the handwriting, at the line where Earl had written that he appeared before the council with the deed, and read the reversionary clause aloud, and the development proposal was tabled. "This town knew once," Dot said. "My grandfather made sure of that." Ron Briggs looked at the journal the way people look at old objects that have suddenly become inconvenient, as if its age were an argument against it, and as if he knew that argument would not hold. Dot picked up the instruction letter. She did not read the full document. She found the line she wanted and read only that. The town will say it was a formality. She read it at the pace Earl had written it, plainly without performance. It was not a formality. It was the terms. Nobody interrupted her. She set the letter back on the table beside the journal, beside the green metal box, and for a moment the room was simply quiet, the particular quiet of a space in which something old and patient has finally been heard by the people who needed to hear it. Earl Hargrove was present in that room, not as a ghost, not as a sentiment, as handwriting and filing stamps and a notarized clause and one sentence that had outlasted every man who had ever tried to look past it. Ron Briggs said quietly, "What are you asking for, Mrs. Hargrove?" Dot looked at the green box, then at the journal, then at Nathan Vale, who had stopped pretending the document in front of Sylvia was something he might still reach for. "I'm not asking yet," she said. "I'm informing." Sylvia closed her folder with the clean finality of someone who has delivered everything that needed to be delivered. The next step, she said, is a public correction of title-written acknowledgement of the reversion by the town and suspension of all development negotiations involving the Station 3 parcel until Mrs. Hargrove has determined her intentions for her land. Ron Briggs did not answer immediately. He looked at the town attorney. The town attorney looked at his legal pad. Nathan Vale leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man revising a project timeline considerably. Marcus, sitting beside Dot, had been quiet for the entire meeting. He looked at his mother now, not the sideways glance of someone checking in, but the full direct look of a person who has just understood something he should have understood sooner. She had not bought a ruined building for $10. She had inherited a position Earl Hargrove had been building towards since 1938, 87 years of patient, unannounced preparation for a Thursday morning in a small conference room behind Mill Haven Town Hall, where his granddaughter sat in a gray coat with his green metal box on the table in front of her and told the people who had miscounted what they owned that she was not asking. She was informing. The first offer came 3 days after the meeting. Sylvia forwarded it by email on a Sunday evening with a single line of her own. Read carefully. "Call me tomorrow." Dot printed it at her kitchen table, put on her reading glasses, and read it the way she read everything from the top in order, without skipping ahead. It was printed on heavy paper, the kind that conveyed seriousness before you reached the words. Nathan Vale's office had prepared it with the thoroughness of people who understood they were no longer negotiating from a position of advantage and had decided that a large enough number might compensate for that. Marcus saw the number before Dot had finished the page. He stopped talking mid-sentence. Dot read to the end. Then she set the offer on the kitchen table beside Earl's journal and got up to make tea. "Mom, I saw it." "That is not a small number." "No," Dot said. "It isn't." She filled the kettle and set it on the burner and stood at the window while it heated, looking at the backyard in the gray March light. A cardinal on the fence post, the neighbor's oak still bare, ordinary Sunday evening going about its business. The offer was for the entire Station 3 parcel clean purchase, fast closing a confidential settlement with the town built into the structure to resolve the title complications cleanly for all parties. The developer would preserve the front facade, the letter said, and incorporate historic design elements into the final project. Dot had read that sentence 3 times. Historic design elements. She thought about Earl, not the Earl of the journal entries, not the Earl of Chester Oaks's careful recollections, but the Earl she had known briefly as a child, the man at the end of the Sunday dinner table, quiet and early to leave his hands always carrying the particular roughness of work that didn't end at the end of a shift. She wondered if he would have smiled at that phrase. Not broadly, he was not by any account a broad man, but one corner of his mouth, perhaps the way men smile when someone mistakes a coat of paint for a foundation. Sylvia laid out the options the following morning with the same methodical care she brought to everything. Dot could sell outright. She could lease. She could negotiate a partial development rights arrangement that preserved specific elements of the structure. She could require formal historic designation as a condition of any transaction. She could pursue damages from the town for 5 years of managing land it no longer legally owned. She could be aggressive about any or all of it, and the law would support her. Dot listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she asked the one question she needed answered. "What happens to the station if I sell?" Sylvia did not soften it. She had not softened anything throughout this process, and Dot had come to rely on that. The building would almost certainly be gutted for the interior renovation. The facade might be retained if required by local historic review, but the interior would not survive a commercial redevelopment at this scale. Dot sat with that for a moment. The locker row, the apparatus bay floor oil-stained from decades of engines that had gone out and come back. The chief's quarters with the cast-iron radiator and the single window and the wooden chair where she had first held the key up in the gray light and understood that she had been carrying something without knowing what it was. The brass hook at the center of Earl's locker, empty now, its purpose delivered. She had not known her grandfather the way grandchildren know the grandparents who hold them and tell long stories and make themselves available for love, in the ways children recognize immediately. Earl had not been that kind of man. He had sat at the end of the table and said little and left early and gone back to work. But he had built this station with his hands. He had defended it twice in front of a town council with the same document and the same steady voice. He had sealed a metal box behind a locker in 1971 and written a letter to someone he could not name for a situation he could not predict, and trusted the building to keep it until the right. Hargrove came through the door and looked carefully enough to find what was there to be found. He had trusted her specifically without knowing her name. Dot folded the offer and placed it back in its envelope. "No," she said. Marcus looked at her across the table. "No to all of it? I no to selling the land." The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Outside, the cardinal was still on the fence post. Marcus opened his mouth and then closed it again, the particular restraint of a man who has recently been wrong about something significant and is trying to apply that lesson in real time. Dot noticed it and said nothing. Some learning needed room. A week later, she made her own proposal. She had written it out longhand first, the way she had always drafted difficult postal correspondence by hand at the kitchen table, then typed, then reviewed. Sylvia refined the legal language. The substance was Dot's. She would not sell Station 3. She would not sell the land. She would grant the town a limited historic use easement for the public portions of the building contingent on formal written acknowledgement of the title reversion and recorded correction of ownership. The developer could restructure its project around the adjacent parcels if it wished to proceed. The Station 3 footprint was not available. If the project required access improvements across a narrow corridor of her land, she would negotiate a right-of-way lease at fair market rate renewable on 5-year terms. Station 3 itself would remain standing. The apparatus bay would become a small fire heritage center. The original lockers, the bay floor, the equipment that remained the founding photographs Earl's journal properly preserved and displayed. The chief's quarters would become a reading room and community archive open to the public on a regular schedule. The 1938 lockers would stay exactly where Earl had installed them on the back wall of the bay, in the order he had placed them, the Chief E. Hargrove nameplate on the fourth one from the left. Ron Briggs called the proposal complicated. Dot said, so was ignoring the deed for 87 years. He did not use the word complicated again. The settlement took 6 weeks. Sylvia negotiated with the particular patience of someone who understood that the other side needed time to arrive at the correct position on their own terms. The town acknowledged the title error in formal writing, not a letter of understanding, not a memo of intent, but a recorded legal acknowledgement, filed at the county recorder's office document number, assigned permanent. Development negotiations were restructured. Dot received compensation for 5 years of improper municipal management of her land, enough to repair the station's roof, restore the original apparatus bay doors, and establish a maintenance fund that would keep the building sound for decades. Nathan Vale, to his credit, stopped performing and began negotiating in actual terms once the first 2 weeks of positioning had exhausted itself. He was not a bad man. Dot concluded he was a man who had proceeded without adequate information and was now adjusting to the information he had. The access corridor lease was signed at fair market rate. The mixed-use project moved forward on the adjacent parcels without the Station 3 footprint. Everyone arrived at something workable. Marcus stayed through the first week of restoration. He had come from Phoenix prepared to persuade his mother of something. He stayed to work alongside her instead, which was a different and better thing. He wore work gloves and moved carefully and listened more than he spoke, which was an improvement on his arrival. Chester Oakes came on the 3rd day and walked the apparatus bay, slowly touching the locker doors, one by one, in the manner of a man reacquainting himself with something he had not expected to see again. He stopped at Earl's locker for a long time without speaking. Then he said to no one in particular, "He always said this building was the safest place in town. I thought he meant the construction." He paused. He meant something else entirely. Dot did not reply. She thought Chester had said it correctly the first time and the second time, and that both things were true. On the 3rd afternoon of restoration work, Marcus found her standing in front of Earl's locker. Her fingers rested lightly on the nameplate. Chief E. Hargrove. The brushed metal, the stamped capitals, the slight oxidation at the edges that had not been touched in 87 years. She had not moved the nameplate. She had not considered moving it. Marcus stood beside her for a long moment before he spoke. When he did, his voice carried the particular quality of someone who has been working toward something difficult and has finally arrived at it. "I was wrong," he said. Dot kept her fingers on the nameplate. "About the station," he said. "About what you could handle. About all of it. I came here to manage a situation, and there was no situation to manage. There was just you doing exactly what you were doing." She turned and looked at him. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the work, the tired of someone who has had to revise their understanding of a person they believed they already knew completely. Her son, 48 years old, still learning the shape of her. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I know you did." "That doesn't make it right." "No," Dot said. "It doesn't." He swallowed, looked at the locker row, at the original green paint inside Earl's locker, at the brass hook centered on the back panel where the key had hung for decades, and waited. "What do I do now?" Dot reached into her coat pocket and held out a screwdriver. "You're already doing it," she said. He looked at the tool, then at her. Then he nodded, not the quick, confident nod of a man who has decided something, but the slower nod of a man who is beginning to understand something, which was the better kind. Some apologies arrive as sentences. Some arrive as labor offered without ceremony on an ordinary afternoon in an old building that someone decided was worth keeping. Dot had lived long enough to know the difference. She was wise enough not to interrupt the second kind when it finally came. The opening was held on a Saturday in October. Dot had refused the word ceremony when Ron Briggs used it in the first draft of the public announcement. Ceremony implied that the town had been part of saving something, that the outcome had been planned, that the building's survival had been a collective intention rather than the result of one woman moving a locker on a cold March morning because she was methodical and had nowhere else to start. The notice in the Millhaven Courier said simply, "Station 3, Heritage Room, Open House, Saturday, October 12th, 10 o'clock. Dot arrived at 8. The morning was cool and clear, the October light coming in low from the east and catching the front brick in the way that old brick catches morning light when it has survived enough weather to deserve it. The arched apparatus bay doors had been restored. Not replaced, restored. The original steel, cleaned and treated and rehung on new hardware, the arch frames repointed where the mortar had failed. The cast iron Station 3 sign had been cleaned and sealed. The weeds were gone from the concrete apron, though Dot had told the contractor to leave the old cracks visible. He had looked at her with the patient uncertainty of a man accustomed to clients who changed their minds. "People should know what lasted," she said. He had left the cracks. She unlocked the side entrance and stood in the apparatus bay for a moment before turning on any lights. The bay smelled of waxed concrete and old steel, and the coffee she had brought in her thermos, the same thermos she had brought every morning since the first day she came here in the gray pre-dawn quiet, before she knew what the building contained, before she had moved the last locker. She stood in the dark for a moment and let the building be what it had always been before the lights came on, and it became something the public would see. Then she pulled the cord on the first overhead light. The 1938 lockers stood along the back wall exactly as Earl had installed them, all 8. The original green paint inside each one still intact, still the particular institutional color of a Depression-era municipal building that had been built once and not repainted since. The Chief E. Hargrove nameplate on the 4th locker from the left still in its holder, the stamped capitals still legible after 87 years. The 5th locker, the last one Earl had installed, the one behind which he had built the recess, stood slightly forward from the wall, not careless looking, just enough to show the narrow shadow behind it, a suggestion of space, an invitation to look more carefully. The concrete recess itself had been fitted with a small glass panel. Behind the glass, centered on the concrete shelf, a replica of the green Army surplus metal box, positioned exactly as the original had been positioned, exactly as Earl had placed it sometime between 1971 and his death in 1974. The original box was in protected archival storage. Sylvia had been firm about that. Dot had agreed, but only after she had held it one more time before it went into the archive, both hands the way she had carried it out of the recess on the first morning, feeling its particular lightness, the lightness of paper and patience. On the wall beside the locker row, 3 framed documents hung in a line. A reproduction of the original 1938 deed, both pages the standard form and the handwritten reversionary clause, the notary seal visible at the bottom. Beside it, enlarged to reading size, the penciled notation from the county copy. Chief Hargrove Development Inquiry resolved. 1962. 5 words in a county clerk's handwriting, 63 years old, that had sat in the archive unconnected to anything until Anne Fielding pulled the document on a March morning and set it on the viewing table, and beside that Earl's instruction letter. Station 3 letterhead, May 3rd, 1971. The full text enlarged just enough that a person standing at a comfortable distance could read every line without leaning forward. The last 2 sentences were set slightly apart from the rest, the way Earl had written them, separated by a line space in slightly larger letters, as if he had wanted to be certain they were legible, regardless of the age of the reader. I don't know who you are, but if you found the key and came this far, you're a Hargrove. Act like one. Dot had stood in front of those lines the evening before after the contractor left, and the building was quiet for longer than she had expected to stand there. She had not cried. It was not that kind of moment. Some love did not ask for tears. It asked for stewardship for the patient, unhurried work of preserving what had been preserved for you, so that it could be known by people who had not yet arrived. Chester Oakes arrived first at 9:15 with a cane and a blue fire department cap that was older than most of the vehicles in the parking lot. Walter Blythe came with him carrying a manila envelope with 2 folded photographs inside. The first showed Station 3 in 1939, the brick clean, the apron uncracked, the first apparatus gleaming inside the open bay door. Earl stood near the entrance, younger than Dot had ever seen him, one hand resting on the side of the engine, his face turned slightly from the camera, as if the photographer had caught him in the middle of going back to work. The second photograph showed the locker row. Fresh paint, clean floor, the 8 lockers installed and standing the back wall smooth behind them. Earl at the far end of the row alone, facing the camera this time, but not quite looking at it, looking slightly past it the way a man looks when he has just finished something and is already thinking about what comes next. Dot looked at the photograph for a long time. Walter said, he never liked being photographed. No, Dot said, I can see that. Chester tapped the photograph with one finger lightly, the way old men touch old things. That was taken the week he finished installing those lockers. My father mentioned it once, said Earl wouldn't let anyone near the back wall while he was working. Said he had his reasons and he'd share them when he was ready. Chester paused. He never shared them? No, Dot said. He kept them somewhere else. At 10 o'clock, the doors opened and people came in. Retired firefighters who had worked the station in its later decades, some of them moving carefully, some of them standing straight with the particular posture of men who had spent years in gear, young families with children who had been told not to touch things and immediately forgot. 2 town council members who stood near the deed display with the expression of people being careful and respectful in equal measure, which was the right expression for them to have. A school teacher, with 12 fourth graders who lined up in front of the locker row and listened with the intermittent attention of 9-year-olds encountering something they couldn't yet fully understand, but might remember later in the way children sometimes remember things they weren't ready for at the time. A retired dispatcher stood in front of the old call board for several minutes, not speaking, reading the district numbers. She whispered something that Dot couldn't hear from across the room. She didn't need to hear it. Ron Briggs came at 10:30. He came alone, without staff, without the practiced warmth of a public official at a public event. He wore a coat instead of a jacket and carried nothing. He walked directly to the deed display and stood in front of it for several minutes, reading every line of both pages the way the document deserved to be read from the beginning, in order without skipping ahead. When he finished, he crossed the bay to where Dot was standing. "Mrs. Hargrove," he said. He did not extend his hand this time. "I should have read further." Dot looked at him steadily. "Yes," she said. It was not forgiveness and it was not punishment. It was simply the truth stated plainly in the same register Earl had used for things that required accuracy rather than comfort. Briggs received it with the expression of a man who had known it was coming and had decided to come anyway. She found she respected that slightly without making anything of it. Marcus arrived just before noon with coffee and a white pastry box from the bakery on Clement Street. He kissed his mother on the cheek in a way that surprised them both slightly. Then he set the coffee on the work table. In the chief's quarters, looked around the room and noticed that one of the display lights above the locker row had shifted out of its angle overnight. He crossed the bay without being asked and adjusted it, climbing on the step stool the contractor had left and working until the beam fell correctly across the nameplate. He did not ask if she needed help. He simply helped. That was better. That was the right thing. Dot watched him for a moment and then looked away, because some things were better received without being acknowledged directly, and she had known her son long enough to understand which things those were. The afternoon moved slowly and well, the way good October afternoons do, people coming and going, conversations starting and finishing, the building filling, and then gradually quieting as the light outside changed from the flat brightness of midday to the longer gold of late afternoon. Near the end of it, when the last of the visitors had collected their coats, and the fourth graders had been herded back onto their bus, and the bay had settled into the particular quiet that follows a day of being seen, Dot stood alone in front of Earl's locker. The brass hook was still inside. She had left it. It seemed important to leave it. The key was not on it. The key was on a leather cord around her neck beneath her blouse, where she could feel its small, specific weight against her sternum. The same weight she had felt for 3 weeks now, familiar in a different way from the years she had spent with it as a found object, a relic, a piece of her grandfather she carried without understanding. She understood it now. The weight was the same. The meaning of the weight had changed entirely. She had considered briefly returning it to the hook, placing it back where Earl had left it, completing the circle, making the display whole. She had thought about it for approximately 3 minutes. Then she had heard Earl's voice the only way she could hear it now, not as sound, but as the quiet certainty of someone who had arranged things correctly and expected them to stay arranged. Keys belong with the person who knows what they open. She kept it. In the chief's quarters, Earl's journal lay open on the work table under protective glass. The last entry, October 14th, 1971, the final page of his handwriting visible, the last lines clear enough to read without leaning close. People only clean things when something has changed. That has always been enough time. It will be enough time. Dot stood in the doorway and read it one more time. He had not known her as a woman of 72. He had not known about Sylvia Tran or Anne Fielding or the county's archive system or the developer's architectural renderings or Councilman Briggs and his word gesture. He had not known about Marcus flying in from Phoenix with his rolling suitcase and his certainty that his mother needed managing. He had not known the specific morning in March when she would park in front of his station and sit behind the wheel and look at the sign he had painted in 1938 and feel, without being able to explain it, that something was waiting for her to look carefully. He had known people. He had known they would rush. He had known they would assume. He had known they would look at an old building and see a liability before they saw a foundation. He had known that careful people existed and that they moved slowly and noticed small things and followed paper trails to their ends. He had built his plan around the reliable existence of one such person. He had left a key on a hook and trusted the right Hargrove to find it. The October light came through the apparatus bay windows in long gold rectangles and fell across the concrete floor, reaching the locker row, touching the glass panel over the recess. For a moment, the brass pull ring caught the light, small, tarnished still exactly where Earl had threaded it into the concrete in the winter of 1938. Still there. Dot stood with her hands folded and let the room be quiet around her. The town had offered her a ruined fire station for $10 and expected the story to end with a demolition permit and a gracious family who hadn't looked closely enough to know what they'd been given. Earl had written the real ending 87 years earlier in a sealed concrete recess behind a steel locker in a building he had trusted to outlast the people who underestimated it.
It had!
She touched the key through the fabric of her blouse. Then she walked through the bay and turned off the display lights one by one, working from right to left, the way she had always worked methodically in order without skipping steps. The locker row went dark section by section until only the light above Earl's locker remained. She stood in front of the nameplate one last time. Chiefy Hargrove. The stamped capitals, the brushed metal, the slight oxidation at the edges that no one had touched in 87 years because it had not needed touching. "You were right," she said quietly. Not to the room, not to the building. To him, to the man who had come to Sunday dinners and sat at the end of the table and said very little, and left early, who had spent 3 Sundays alone at the back wall of this station in the winter of 1938, building something no one would find for 87 years, who had driven to the county recorder's office alone once a year for 3 decades, and filed documents in his granddaughter's name, because he believed the ground was worth something, and he wanted it to stay where it belonged. She reached up and switched off the last light. The bay went dark and quiet and still. She stood in it for a moment, the particular darkness of an old building at the end of a good day full of everything that had happened in it, and everything that would be remembered from it. Then she picked up her thermos and her coat and her keys, and she went home. If Earl Hargrove's quiet 87-year plan stayed with you, the image of a man alone at a back wall building something no one would find until the right person looked carefully enough, please subscribe to Old House Secrets. Every week we find another property that was hiding something important. And tell me in the comments, have you ever inherited something that turned out to be more than it looked? I want to hear about it.